Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. On the afternoon of February 25th, 2013, a woman named Janeene Jones was in a car at a local shopping plaza in the city of Northport, Florida. The 49-year-old was with her friend Becky, as well as a new business contact that Becky had introduced her to, and the group had just finished up a midday meeting. Janeene was looking for help with some issues related to her rapidly expanding real estate business, and had taken the meeting in the car, both because of her tight schedule and so that they could drive by and take a look at a specific property. From Janeene's perspective, when everything wrapped up, it seemed like things had gone well. That was, until she opened the passenger side door and stepped out into the parking lot. She made it just a few feet before the entire scene was swarmed by police. As it turned out, for as ordinary and casual as Janeene's demeanor had been that day, the situation was anything but. She was at the end of a long and twisted road, the full disturbing scope of which had only recently become apparent to investigators. Before we get to today's story, if you find our content interesting and informative and haven't already, we'd be honored if you'd take a second to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell. It helps you to keep up to date with our latest releases, and helps us to keep up with that pesky, ever-changing YouTube algorithm. With that out of the way, let's get to the video. When Janeene Lee Monsell met Max Jones in early 1991, it seemed like it was meant to be. Up until that point, Janeene had been unlucky in love. Despite only being in her mid-20s, she was already twice divorced and the single mother to a young son. However, things with Max felt different. He was a hard-working carpenter who was passionate about what he did and was stable and reliable. The two fell for each other almost instantly, and within just a few months decided that they were ready to spend the rest of their lives together. Janeene and Max were married in a small ceremony at a local church in the community of Englewood, Florida that October, and it wasn't long before their family started growing. They welcomed their son Zach into the world the following summer, and in 1994 their daughter Alex was born. While the Jones family was by no means wealthy, for the next few years they got by well enough. Janeene bounced around between jobs, but Max's steady income from his carpentry work always seemed to get them by. It was enough for them to afford their modest two-bedroom home in the city of Northport, where they raised their kids and quickly became enmeshed in their local community. What the Joneses lacked in material wealth, they tried to make up for with the kinds of riches that money can't buy. They had a large circle of friends, were well liked and respected in their neighborhood and church, and seemed genuinely happy together. However, as it so often does, eventually, money started to take a toll on Max and Janeene's marriage. The grind of living paycheck to paycheck was difficult, especially on Max, who constantly took on side jobs on top of his regular carpentry work to make sure that they stayed afloat. The situation caused countless arguments, during which Max would often lose his temper. Things went from bad to worse in February of 1998, when Janeene was the subject of a scandal while working as a corrections officer at the Charlotte County Jail. It turned out that she had been having an affair with a male inmate at the facility and was caught after someone reported the situation to her supervisor. During the course of an investigation, numerous love letters were uncovered that Janeene had been passing to the inmate. She chose to resign before she was called in for questioning. Needless to say, when word got out about the affair, Janeene and Max were not in a good place. The situation was a double gut punch, firstly because of the infidelity, and secondly because it added to their financial problems. They decided to stay together for the sake of the children, but the marriage was never the same. The couple tried to maintain the same happy image as a family that they always had, but it was obvious to those that knew them well that this was merely a facade. One of those who was most aware of this was longtime friend of the family, John Chamberlain, who was close friends with Max and had met him and Janeene at church. For years, he watched as the Joneses grew further and further apart. Even so, John, like everyone else, was still caught completely off guard by what happened next. While the Joneses were both seemingly trapped in a loveless marriage, things eventually reached a functional, if not pleasant, status quo. They each spent more time with their respective friends, and as years passed and their kids grew up, they both maintained good relationships with them individually. In 2011, though, a wrench was thrown into this dynamic when Max began to suffer from severe and sustained stomach and intestinal problems. He was hospitalized multiple times and began to rapidly lose weight. But despite this, doctors were at a loss to explain his sudden health issues. Before this, he had been an otherwise healthy man in his early 50s. The family did their best to cope with Max's mysterious condition, hoping that it would soon be figured out. However, they were nonetheless completely unprepared when tragedy struck. Just 3 days after Thanksgiving that year, Janeene, Zach, and Alex found Max in a serious state of distress in his bedroom. He was lying in bed and was clammy, pale, and starting to become unresponsive. They called 911 and were instructed to start CPR. Minutes later, paramedics arrived and took over. Sadly, though, there was nothing that anyone could do. Max was pronounced dead a short time later. The cause was ruled to be a heart attack. Needless to say, Max's friends and family were stunned by his sudden death. They were aware that he had been sick, but it had always appeared that the problem was rooted in some kind of stomach or intestinal issue. This heart attack had seemingly come out of nowhere. Zach and Alex, now 19 and 17 in particular, struggled to come to terms with the loss of their father. The situation left Janeene with the sole financial responsibility of providing for herself and her children. Given the family's previous struggles, it looked like they might be in dire straits. However, in the next few months, she would manage to miraculously turn things around. In the months following Max's death, Janeene amazed those around her at how quickly she was able to pick up the pieces. A large part of this, of course, was the $1 million life insurance payout that she received following her husband's death, though in addition to this, she was also quite proactive. Using her newly acquired money, Janeene started a real estate company called My Retirement LLC and began fixing up and renting out houses across the city of Northport. Like many places in the United States, Northport had seen a building boom in the early 2000s, but the 2008 financial crisis had hit the area hard, leaving many abandoned and foreclosed homes. These properties were a prime opportunity for someone like Janeene, who now had the cash to take advantage of the situation. At the same time, Janeene was able to move herself and her kids out of their modest 2-bedroom home and into a different property in town. She said that it would be good for them to leave behind the bad memories of what had happened there, and with her successful new business up and running, they could now afford something nicer than where they had previously lived. The stars seemed to align even further for Janeene when she also seemingly managed to find love once again. Her new flame was a local cable TV installer named Matt Smith, who quickly became an integral part of Janeene's real estate business. In fact, the business was such a success that Janeene soon had to hire outside help. For this, she turned to John Chamberlain, who was a plumber and also had many of the necessary skills needed to make other property renovations. The two struck a deal. In exchange for John's services at Janeene's various rental properties, he and his 11-year-old daughter would be given one of these homes to live in at a severely reduced rental rate. For a few months, it all seemed to be going well. However, under the surface, some strange things were starting to emerge. Despite Janeene's success, there were aspects of her new life that started to feel odd to those closest to her. In particular, it seemed to Zach and Alex that she was moving on from their father's death incredibly quickly. Though she had been married to Max for 20 years, she sold off all of his possessions, including his cherished tools, almost immediately after he was gone. Her new relationship was one that they also struggled to understand. Matt Smith was only 26 years old, barely half Janene's age, and only a few years older than Zach. The kids were even more floored when just a few months into the relationship, in July of 2012, Janeene announced to everyone during a get-together at their house that she and Matt had gotten married during a recent trip to Las Vegas. Max hadn't even been dead for a year. Meanwhile, Janeene began spending more and more time partying with a newer friend of hers named Becky. She started experimenting with alcohol and drugs and began spending lavishly on vacations, new vehicles, and even a second home in the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. All of it seemed out of character for Janeene to those that knew her best. Around the same time, John Chamberlain was noticing some red flags of his own related to Janeene and Matt's real estate business. In particular, he was starting to become concerned about the number of properties where he was being instructed to simply drill locks off to gain entry. Janeene reassured John that this was a totally normal part of the industry. Because some of these houses had sat vacant for so long or had simply been abandoned, there was no good way to get in contact with the former owners, meaning that keys just often weren't available. Despite this explanation, John had an increasingly uneasy feeling about the whole thing. His worst fears were proven right when he received a startling phone call from one of Janene's tenants. The tenant said that someone had just shown up at their front door, wanting to know what they were doing inside their house. Though John had previously had his suspicions that something wasn't quite right about Janeene and Matt's business, the alarming phone call from the tenant pushed him over the edge. He confronted Janeene, saying that he wanted no part in any of this anymore if something illegal was going on. She responded by sending John an eviction notice. He refused to leave, escalating the situation to civil court. He also decided to go to the Northport police. John met with detectives and told them everything that he had been involved in with Janene's real estate company over the past few months, explaining his reservations about things like the fact that she had instructed him to drill locks on a number of empty houses. When investigators assured him that his instincts were likely correct, he started to share more, including his suspicions about the death of his friend, Max Jones. John shared with police several of the red flags that others close to the family had already noticed. He said that despite Max's health problems, his death seemed to come out of nowhere, and that Janeene didn't seem to be grieving at all in the aftermath. In fact, she had already remarried a much younger man and appeared to be on quite a spending spree. What bothered John most, though, was the fact that Janeene had had Max cremated within 2 days of his death, despite his unexplained illness and without any further analysis or autopsy. Bizarrely, she had then shown up at John's house and given him the urn with Max's ashes in it. Thanks to John's tip, police put Janeene under surveillance, hoping to learn more both about Max's death and about the suspicious real estate business. What they found was concerning. It turned out that though Janeene and Matt had been renovating and renting out properties, they never actually purchased any of them. They had simply been taking the locks off of homes, fixing them up mildly, and forging paperwork stating that the houses had been bought or handed over to them. Furthermore, Janeene had no real estate license and had been listing her fraudulent properties for rent on Craigslist. For months now, she and Matt had been bilking unsuspecting families out of tens of thousands of dollars. Her so-called business was a complete sham. However, things were about to get a whole lot darker. While it's unclear if Janeene knew that John Chamberlain had gone to police, in the meantime, she decided that the impending civil case between them was enough of a threat to her business that she had to act. She confided in her friend Becky, saying that in no uncertain terms, John needed to be dealt with. He had far too much knowledge about her illegal scheme, and this civil case was becoming a costly nuisance. She wanted him dead. Becky told her that she thought she might be able to help. Through her contacts in the illegal drug world, she knew a guy who took care of these kinds of things. On February 20th, 2013, Becky and Janeene met at a local restaurant in Northport for lunch to hammer out all of the details. They needed to be sure that they knew what the plan was before Becky made the introduction. During the meal, Janeene provided Becky with a physical description of John, as well as an address. She wrote the whole thing out on a napkin, including a diagram of his house with the best possible points of entry for the crime. Janeene said that she needed it all to happen fast. She was timing this with an upcoming cruise that she was planning to take. She wanted to be out of town when the murder took place, providing her with a solid alibi. Becky took all of this information, and 5 days later, arranged a meeting with her contact. On February 25th, Becky, Janeene, and the hitman got into a car together and made the final preparations. Janeene provided the hitman with a photo of John and suggested either snapping his neck or shooting him. She said that she wasn't too particular, as long as the crime scene was meticulously cleaned and the body was properly disposed of. If they can't find the body, they can't prove nothing, she stated. They drove past John Chamberlain's home, where Janeene explained how the killer could get inside and warned him about any potential hazards. One of these was John's 11-year-old daughter, though once again, Janeene said she wasn't all that concerned. With a literal wave of her hand, she told the hitman that she didn't really care about the girl, and that if she got in the way of the hit on John, she should be taken out too. Again, as long as she was disposed of in a way where no one would ever find her. As if this weren't evil enough, as they neared the end of their negotiations, Janeene threw out a truly chilling surprise proposal. She asked if she could possibly get what she referred to as a 2-for-1. Janeene explained that she had grown tired of her new husband Matt Smith, and no longer wanted him around either. Like John, he was a liability. Not only that, though, the $1 million life insurance policy she had taken out on him had finally kicked in now as well. He was way more useful to her dead than alive. Janeene said that they could take out Matt a couple of weeks after John, only his death they would stage to appear like a random carjacking. The hitman agreed to Janeene's terms, and she agreed to pay him $4,000 for each of the 2 killings. She said that she would give him a $1,000 payment in cash beforehand to show that she was serious. When the meeting was over, Janeene stepped out of the car. Seconds later, she was surrounded by police and placed under arrest. While Janeene had been wary of John Chamberlain, she had missed the obvious threat right in front of her. You see, he wasn't the only person talking to police. Her new friend Becky had also been working with detectives. It's a little unclear in the sources that we came across during our research, but several seem to suggest that it was Becky who actually tipped them off that Janeene was planning to have John murdered. Unbeknownst to Janeene, for the last several weeks, she had been the subject of an investigation dubbed Operation Black Widow. Over the course of multiple interactions, Becky had been wearing a hidden camera and recording device, including at the February 20th lunch that they had, where Janeene drew out her twisted murder plan on a napkin. The so-called hitman Becky had introduced Janeene to was an undercover police officer named Dominic Harris, who had also recorded his interactions with Janeene in the car. He was forced to disguise his disgust and surprise as Janeene not only waved off the potential murder of an 11-year-old girl as collateral damage, but out of nowhere requested the second hit on her husband Matt Smith, which no one had been prepared for. Speaking of being unprepared, Janeene was apparently caught quite off guard by the fact that she had been set up. Authorities would later state in interviews that there was a look of visible anger on her face as she was surrounded and arrested. One source we came across stated that she was so surprised that she, wet her pants. She was subsequently charged with 2 counts of solicitation to commit first-degree murder, as well as 33 offenses related to her real estate fraud scheme. Another person completely caught off guard by the fallout from Janeene's February 25th arrest was her new husband, Matt Smith. He was stunned to learn that he was also due to be murdered, and though he initially refused to cooperate with the investigation, he soon turned on Janeene after he too was arrested and learned he would be facing nearly 3 dozen charges in relation to the real estate scheme. Matt divorced Janeene in October of that year. In exchange for his testimony against Janeene in both cases, Matt was given a generous plea deal. After being given credit for 6 months served in jail, he pleaded guilty to just 1 count of scheming to defraud in January of 2014 and was sentenced to 4 years probation. He was also ordered to pay back $17,500 in restitution to the victims of the real estate fraud. This angered John Chamberlain, who viewed Matt's sentence as both a slap on the wrist and a waste of his own time, given how much information and cooperation he had provided to police, especially because the evidence against Matt and Janeene was overwhelming, and ultimately, Matt wouldn't ever even testify against her. She ended up opting not to go to trial as well. John filed an ethics complaint against the state attorney's office, though it's unclear what, if anything, actually became of this. In May of 2014, Janeene Jones pleaded no contest to the 2 solicitation to commit murder charges. At her sentencing, she blamed alcohol and drug use for her poor decision-making, saying that after some soul-searching, she believed that she could once again be a productive member of society. Extended family members told the judge that this wasn't the real Janeene, and that all of this had been brought on by the grief associated with her first husband Max's sudden death. However, when a 20-minute video of Janeene in the car with the undercover police officer was played in the courtroom, it proved a sobering reminder of just how far Janeene was willing to go to get what she wanted. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, we weren't able to find much information about the extent to which police pursued the real estate fraud case against her after her conviction, though according to her inmate records, she was convicted on at least 1 count of occupational license fraud. If you've watched everything up until this point, I'd guess that there's a pretty good chance you've noticed that we've left a rather important loose end hanging here. In fact, there's a distinct possibility that at least some of you out there have been yelling at me through your screen for several minutes, wondering if I was going to bring up Max Jones again before wrapping this whole thing up. If that's the case, well, then you're in luck. Though sadly, I don't really have any good news to share with you. Though police did investigate Janeene, considering the extremely sudden and suspicious circumstances of Max's death, unfortunately, the fact that he was cremated before an autopsy was done made proving any kind of foul play essentially impossible. This means that at least officially, Max died of natural causes, and we'll likely never know for sure whether or not he was murdered, let alone whether Janeene was or wasn't involved. That being said, I, for one, can't help but think back to the chilling choice of words Janeene uttered while trying to arrange the murders of potentially 3 people. Quote, "If they can't find the body, they can't prove nothing." Sadly, at least for now, it seems that she was right. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a minute to thank our amazing supporters over on Patreon. As many of you are aware, our situation on YouTube always seems to be a bit uncertain, but our patrons help to ensure that we can continue to make content like this long term without having to worry as much about what surprises might be thrown our way. Plus, patrons also get access to 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. If you'd like to help support the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/crimezone to join. You can also find that link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care.